Now, so far in our coverage of aggregate expenditures, when we have talked about consumption, we have focused exclusively on disposable income and the relationship that exists between consumption and disposable income. So if you'll recall, we learned how to graph our consumption function, where we had disposable income down here and consumption on this axis. And then, of course, we had our 45-degree line, which represented all the points where consumption would actually equal disposable income. And then we would graph our actual consumption function. So it may look something like this. So again, this was representing the level of consumption that would take place at different levels of income. So anytime we have a change in our income, we would be moving along our consumption function. So in other words, if my income was initially $100, I would be right here. Whereas if my disposable income increased to $200, we can clearly see that I would move here. So in other words, I'd be moving up along my consumption function. So anytime there's a change in disposable income, that's going to cause movement along our existing consumption function. However, remember that we also talked about autonomous consumption. In other words, notice we intersect our axis right here, meaning that there's a certain level of consumption that is not dependent upon income. So again, notice that income is 0 right here, and yet we may have consumption of maybe like $30, let's say. So in other words, that means we have $30 of autonomous consumption. In other words, even when income is 0, we're still spending $30. So what we want to understand is what influences autonomous consumption. In other words, what are the factors other than disposable income that are going to cause us to spend money? And that's what we're looking at right here, is the other determinants of consumption. In other words, our level of wealth, our expectations, and demographics are all going to influence autonomous consumption. Now, you'll also notice that I have taxes listed. We're not going to spend too much time talking about taxes because we're going to discuss taxes extensively when we get into our chapter on fiscal policy. But again, taxes will also affect your autonomous consumption, but we're not going to spend too much time going over that. What I want to focus on is these other determinants of consumption. So again, just to recap before I move on to autonomous consumption, we know that disposable income is the primary determinant. In other words, this right here, disposable income, this is the most important factor that influences how much money we spend. However, we also have wealth expectations and demographics, which will also impact how much we spend. Now, wealth, by definition, is simply the value of all assets owned by a household. So let's say, for example, that you have money in a savings account. Let's say that you own your house outright. Things like that. Let's say again that you have money in your 401 account. In other words, all of these are going to be examples of wealth. And so what we believe is that when a household's wealth changes, that also can cause autonomous consumption to change. So again, let's go ahead and start out looking at our consumption function again. And then let's say, for example, that wealth increases. In other words, think of anything that could cause your wealth to increase. Suppose that, just to make it easy to see what the understanding between is, let's say I win the lottery. In other words, now instead of only having $10,000 in my savings account, I now have $1 million in my savings account because I have now won the lottery. So again, when my wealth increases, I'm not going to move along my consumption function because my disposable income did not change. In other words, my income, my paycheck, that's staying the same from month to month. What happened is I have a whole lot more money in my savings account now. So what's going to change is my autonomous consumption. In other words, let's say before I only had $100 of autonomous consumption, meaning that's all the money that I spent that wasn't dependent upon how much money I make. But now that I have $1 million sitting in the bank, maybe now I'm going to increase my autonomous consumptions up to 1,000. In other words, now I'm going to spend a lot more money that's not dependent upon my income. So now that my wealth has increased, notice that what that does is shift my consumption function up. In other words, an increase in wealth will cause autonomous consumption to increase, which is why our entire consumption function is going to shift. And of course, the opposite would happen if you had a decrease in wealth. So let's say, for example, that the wealth that I was talking about was the equity in my home. Let's say that I had $200,000 of equity in my home, and then suddenly the housing market collapsed and all that equity went away. So then that would be the same thing as saying my wealth has decreased, which would cause my autonomous consumption to decline. So again, anytime you have a change in wealth, it's going to shift the consumption function. You are not going to move along the curve. The second factor that alters autonomous consumption would be our expectations. So again, we can look at it the same way. You start out with your consumption function, which again is illustrating all of the consumption that is dependent upon disposable income. And then of course, the point that we intersect, that's the autonomous consumption. And then let's say, for example, that I start to feel really pessimistic about the future of the economy. In other words, let's say, for example, that reports start coming out saying that the stock market isn't doing well, that unemployment rates are going up, firms are increasingly cutting back on production. You know, that right there leads me to believe that the economy may be headed for a recession. And so what's the first thing that I'm going to do? In other words, anytime you think the economy is headed for a recession, that tends to make consumers want to spend less and save more, because that can impact my expectations of my future job, my future income earning potential, things like that. So again, if I start to feel more pessimistic about the economy, that's going to cause my consumption function to shift down like so. So in other words, what's going to happen is autonomous consumption is going to decline. I'm going to move from here to here. And again, that's if I feel pessimistic about the economy. The opposite would happen if I felt optimistic. In other words, you'll see that I have listed here that if I feel favorable about the economy, that's going to cause me to be more willing to increase the amount of money that I spend and decrease that I save. And so that's a big problem when you're coming out of a recession, is in order to successfully push the economy into growth, people have to be willing to spend money. However, people don't want to spend their money until they feel absolutely confident that the economy is truly recovering. You know, feel confident that they're not going to lose their jobs, things like that. So even though expectations can be subjective and difficult to measure, the government knows, you know, they send out these surveys on a regular basis asking people how they feel about the economy, because they know expectations are a very important determinant of autonomous consumption in the economy. If we can't get people to feel favorably about the economy, people are not going to be willing to spend more money. Now, the third factor that can influence autonomous consumption is simply the demographic makeup of society. And we can actually look at this two different ways. The first thing that we can look at is simply the size of your population. In other words, the size of your population will influence how much autonomous consumption there is taking place in the economy. So for example, let's say that this is your economy's current consumption function, and then let's say that your population increases. Well, of course, if there's more people in society, then that means there's going to be more consumption taking place, including autonomous consumption. So in other words, your consumption function would shift up like so. In other words, autonomous consumption would increase if you had an increase in population. So that's what we see going on here. And then of course, vice versa. If you have a decrease in population, then you should see autonomous consumption declining and your consumption function would be shifting down. However, let's say we're not talking about the population. What if we're talking about the age makeup of your society? That actually impacts your consumption function differently. So in other words, we can start out with the same consumption function like so, when we're showing the relationship between consumption and income. But let's say that we say that increasingly you have more and more of your households that are really, really old. Well, we know that really, really old people tend to be retired, therefore they tend to spend a much larger percentage of their income. In other words, they have what we call a higher marginal propensity to consume. So do younger households. People that are really young also tend to have really high marginal propensities to consume. And remember what that means, that if there's a change in income, your MPC tells you how much of that additional income you're going to spend and how much of it you're going to save. Well, again, if you're old and retired and you have a change in income, let's say your income goes up by $100, you don't necessarily need to save very much of that because you're not saving for retirement anymore. You're spending all of your money because you are retired. So you may have a very, very high MPC. Whereas if you're middle-aged and you have a change in income, you're probably going to save a larger percentage of that because you're still saving for retirement. So middle-aged households tend to have lower MPCs. They save more of their changes in income. So what that does is impact the slope of the consumption function. Let's say, for example, that you have an increase in retired households. In other words, more and more of your population is old. Then what that's going to do is cause your consumption function to get steeper, right? In other words, it may stay here, but it gets steeper like so, meaning that you have a higher MPC now because you have a lot more older households in the economy, meaning that when they have changes in income, they tend to spend a lot more of it and save a lot less than if you have a demographic that is made up of primarily middle-aged households. So again, if we're talking about population, then we're actually talking about shifting the consumption function. But if we're talking about differences in the age makeup of your population, we're talking about possibly altering the slope of your consumption function because the MPC is going to change. So at this point, I already told you that we're not going to spend any time talking about taxes, but we do know that obviously the tax rate that the government charges us is going to impact the autonomous consumption also. So that can also impact, where we intersect our axis. But now what I want to do is just wrap up this lecture on the factors that influence autonomous consumption. So again, we know that again, even though we didn't talk about it, we know that taxes will impact autonomous consumption. We know that wealth will impact autonomous consumption. We know that expectations will impact autonomous consumption. And then we know demographics. In other words, if we're talking about how many people are in the population, will influence. And so if any of these change, what it will do is shift your consumption function. And that's what we're looking at right here. In other words, if if consumption was shifting to C1 like we see going on over here, that would mean that either taxes went down, that would mean that wealth increased, it would mean that consumers felt more favorably about the economy, or that your population increased. And of course, if your consumption function is shifting down, like from C to C2, then the opposite is occurring. In other words, taxes are increasing, wealth is declining, consumers are not feeling very favorable about the economy, or the size of your population is going down. And so again, it's not causing movement along the consumption function. We are shifting. We are shifting the level of autonomous consumption that is taking place in the economy. You'll also notice that I have the corresponding savings function posted because, remember, the only two things you can do with your money is spend it or save it. So if I'm spending more, in other words, if autonomous consumption is increasing, then that means autonomous saving has to be decreasing. So you'll notice that when the consumption function shifts from C to C1, meaning that there's been an increase in autonomous consumption, we see a corresponding shift of the savings function going down. In other words, if we're consuming more, so that's what we're looking at right here, the C moving from C to C1, that means autonomous saving has to be declining. So that's why we see our savings function shifting from S to S1. So again, anytime you have an increased autonomous consumption, that means you have a decrease in autonomous saving, and vice versa. Now you'll notice that I have a question down here just to get you critically thinking about the real world and these kind of things happening. I say, think about the housing collapse that just occurred during the recession. How could this have impacted the consumption and savings functions? So again, you can go and draw a consumption function, hypothetically what it would have looked like prior, like so. And so initially, when the housing market was booming, so I'll say housing boom, in other words, people's values in their house were increasing dramatically. You can buy a house and within a year you may have had $100,000 of equity. So during the housing boom, that caused an increase in household wealth. So initially, it would have caused autonomous consumption to increase. So it would have shifted up like so. And so this right here is what we would have saw initially. In other words, here was the initial level of autonomous consumption. And I guess I should have finished my graph here. And then the housing boom causes an increase in average household wealth, so it causes autonomous consumption to increase like so. But then we see that the housing market collapse. In other words, we go into the recession, and then we know that people started walking away from their homes like crazy. Housing prices dropped dramatically. And so that's the same thing as saying that there was a decrease in wealth. In other words, people saw all of that home equity disappear basically overnight. And at the same time, that also impacted our expectations. In other words, the economy was spiraling into a recession very, very quickly, which we know will also cause people to want to spend less and save more. So once the housing collapse occurred, that caused autonomous consumption to decline dramatically, which again pushed us or helped to fuel us moving into that severe recession that we just experienced. So again, you can see it play out in the real world where our autonomous levels of consumption were severely impacted by first an increase in wealth because of the housing boom, and then of course the corresponding decrease in wealth and negative impact on our expectations once that housing market collapsed.